Okay, yesterday I was videotaping and the camera stopped, so this will be part two of the specialized masking. And as I explained yesterday, I'm responding to a request by a viewer named Everything Collector. And he'd been masking quite a bit. This year alone, he's masked over 50 negatives, which is 5 months. So he's been doing over 10 negatives a month. This is only May of 2018. So I wanted to respond to his second request, which was, can you show a negative and the mask used to produce the final mask of my father's El Capitan image, which I did yesterday. But I did that over 2 years ago, and so I wasn't real clear on how I may have come up with the final mask, and I did the best I could to remember what I did. But today I wanted to complete this by talking about an image that I just finished. So the masking is still clear in my head. So I'm going to show you how I photographed a pepper. The pepper image came about because I've always liked Edward Weston's pepper, but knowing that I could never afford to purchase one, I thought, oh, why don't I just shoot one of my own? So I went to like a grocery store and I went through a number of peppers and I picked 3 of them that looked interesting to me, and I photographed all 3, and I picked one of them and I worked on it. So that's what I'll be talking about. I shot it in a funnel, which is what Edward Weston did. He put his pepper in a funnel, but I put salt on the bottom of the funnel. I thought salt and pepper. And the salt would act as an anchor so I could position the pepper without it falling over and so forth. So that worked pretty well. And my exposure, if I remember right, was f45 at 1 minute. And, well, because of the lens extension, I had to use quite a bit more exposure than what the meter told me. Another thing was the pepper is only this big, so I couldn't really measure all the sections of the pepper, so I just placed the background in off-white, where it would reproduce off-white. I didn't want the salt to look pure white, and I wanted the darkest part of the pepper to be black, and then the pepper obviously would fall in between, and because it's not large, I couldn't individually measure every small area of the pepper, so I gave it my best guess on exposure, and the negative came out fine. So I wanted to show you that and start from the standpoint of the negative and a straight print from the negative and how I masked it. Okay, but before I get started on that, I wanted to show you something that I forgot to show you yesterday, and that is this image here, which is my zone system test for a normal negative, and I had masked to get more detail out of the shadow area without losing the blacks, to separate the detail from the black so that I had good local contrast here. And that was my typical masking. It's kind of like something you can generally do, but I also had said yesterday that masking was an individual. You would approach masking for the photograph, so you don't have a set way of masking. You have to think about what you're doing before you just start masking 50 negatives, you know. I mean, you get good at the mechanics, punching, you know, what your exposure should be, but anyway, So I wanted to show you this again. And so I'm going to put this back into the light area. Move the camera here. Now, I had said that this area was lacking local contrast, so I masked for that and came up with this. So hopefully you can see that this has got better contrast than that. But what I wanted to point out today is this area. The mask lifted zone 2 and 3 up towards 4 and 5, and it merges here. So the local contrast here is not as good as this. So that's why when I used to do masking, a lot of masking, I would work, and at the end, sometimes the print was really disappointing because the original print without any masking looked better than after I had done all this masking. Well, this is a good example why. If this was your main subject, then this is better. So I didn't know that the first 3-4 years I was masking. I was just masked because it would work for some certain images, but because the originals were always different, I didn't start to make this connection until a couple years into masking, and then it took me a long time to really visualize how I would want to mask. But this is an overall mask, and it was meant to lift up this area. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that, and that's what I meant when I said, when you mask, you have to be careful. You have to really think about it, look at it, because every image is different, and what do you want to do to this print to make it better? And generally, you want to isolate certain areas of the image to make that print really stand out so that the viewer can feel what it is you're feeling. And, that's the basis behind this lesson. So just talk about specialized masking. How do you address certain issues, okay? Right now. Okay, so I'm going to go straight to my negative. This is my negative of the pepper. And the background was salt, and the pepper is sitting on a salt. Now, when I made a print, I should turn off this. It came out like this. So you can see my exposure was, I used 40 magenta, 2.20 light level. That was a light projected onto the easel with the enlarger, and then I used 27 seconds. And the background came out just right. So this being off-white is what I didn't want it pure white. And the blacks are good. The blacks inside the pepper are strong. Everything else is too dark, which tends to happen. I mean, you very seldom get lighting that is perfect for your particular subject. But the information's in the negative. Obviously, you can go to a higher contrast and print this lighter, but then the salt wouldn't be right. But actually, this is what I expected. Now I thought, okay, I'll mask it. So I had to think about how I was going to tackle this. And when I proceeded, get this down, I knew that I didn't want I didn't want to mask this. So one of the first things I did was I made this. I made two of them. Here's the second one. And I don't know if you can see this, but this is still as light as that. Okay, this background salt is light, and so is the stem of the pepper. So I opaqued, I just took a black pen and opaqued it. And so when I combine these two, I get that. Without this now, I make this. And that's not lith film. That's a Ilford ortho film, which is no longer available. What's nice about it is you can handle it under red light and see what you're doing. And I contacted that. I made that from that. So now I've got density here, and it's clear in where the pepper was. And I bleached it because it's not as high contrast as I want. So, I use this ferric cyanide bleach, which I explained in the masking sections of my previous videos. Now, though, I can put this here. And now I can mask the pepper without masking, without getting any exposure into the background. Okay. Now I no longer need this, because that was made just to make the background. Now I had also made my typical black mask, and this is 3 sheets of film. So the idea here is to get just the blacks to render on the film. And after those are dried, I put that on top of here. And then I made this. So now I can lighten these areas all the way up to the stem. These areas obviously will continue to print dark where the black areas were. And I don't touch the background. Okay. So that's one mask I made. Another thing I did was I made this. There's 2 sheets of film here, also bleached. So now I can, anything made through this, these will come out lighter, okay? Because I've gone up the grayscale. Let's try to explain this. You can begin to see why it's hard for me to remember what I did 2 years ago, because there's so many films. This one allows me to bring detail up around zone 2, similar to the shot of the fence. I'm going way down to the bottom of the grayscale and lifting it above black. This one lets me, it goes all the way to zone 4 or 5. So now anything above 5 is going to come through next when I expose through this. So now I'm bringing up 2 sections of the grayscale without contaminating the black, without giving any exposure to the black. So I have really good local contrast in that area. Okay. And then Here's the negative. That's to retain the black. And then I make this. Oh, sorry. When I made this one, I didn't use the original. This negative. I didn't go back, I didn't use the original negative. I put this down and this down, and then I made that. That's a neutral density mask. So I'm adding a flood of gray over everything except the black and except the background. So now I'm lifting all the zones except for the black. I'm lifting everything up. So there's 3 masks here. Let's look at them. Okay. Now, when I'm doing this, I'm using a half sheet. I cut it and I test it. And I'm going to bring the camera to my darkroom. Okay. This is my sink area. And here's my light box. So when I process, while the film is still wet, I can look at it, and I have all these densities here. So I don't know if you can read. I can 0.44, 0.4, just 0.0. So I can compare the density of my mask against what's on my light box here. Okay. So what I do is I test. And I just use half sheet, and I have a certain light level, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, and I adjust it until I get the density I want. And I think, based on my experience, this is how dark I want this area of the grayscale. This is how dark I want this area. And so it's all by experience, which does take some time. But if you understand my very first lesson on density range, how paper responds to density range, then you have a head start, because you're affecting the density range of the original with masking. It's not how dark the negative is, it's how the range. So therefore I came up with, okay, this is my best exposure, and I used it. Now, in my father's negative, I had 3 masks on the final neg, which is not a good idea. It's a lot of dust, and registration becomes an issue very easily. So what I did here was, each time I said, okay, this is my exposure, I would expose a sheet of film and take it off the pins, put it back into the drawer. When I get to the second one, I say, okay, this is my, and I take the same sheet of film and double expose it, put it back into the pins, and make that exposure. So the mask that I wound up making had 3 exposures. And I know this is the part that's really weird. This is the final mask. It got 3 exposures, and it doesn't look like these 3 combined. It doesn't look like that. And it took me a long time to get used to that. You have to ignore the fact that it looks different. You just have to trust that it's going to work. So that got 3 exposures. I processed it, and then I put it on the final neg. Okay, so that's my final mask. And quite often it's not quite right. So the second one is, but this one worked. This one really worked. I was very pleased. So here is that's the straight print unmasked, and here's the masked print. Okay, now I don't know. And it's actually the same exposure, 40 magenta, 2.2, 27 seconds. Because I didn't really want, I mean, this is lighter than that, but this is fine. The background came out nice and off-white. The blacks are very strong. But the whole pepper now comes forward. So when I made the 5x7, I said to myself, oh, it worked just like I thought. So relatively quickly, within the next week, I went and made a blow up. I made a 16x20. I'll show you that. Okay. So this is the final print. Now, I'm going to frame it, mat it, frame it, and put it outside the kitchen. So when I walk into the kitchen, I'll see this pepper. Hopefully it will inspire me to be a better chef. You can see the wrinkles. And the shape. Of the pepper. I call it my aging pepper. Because after I bought the pepper, I actually left it in the refrigerator for like a week before I did the photography. So it started to shrivel up, which I actually didn't mind. Okay. So that's my pepper shot. Now, I wound up with this to make that. Now I have to clean it and put it back together. I don't know if I want to print another one. I only printed two. But look at this. One, two, three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sheets. Right? I went through 10 sheets of film, drying this, doing it, drying this, keeping everything in your head, like what it's for, just to make one film. And I kept it, thinking, oh, I might come in handy, because normally I just discard it, or I reuse these films to strip in smaller sheets for registration purposes. But I kept this thinking, well, maybe it'll come in handy when I try to explain masking, so I'm glad I kept them. But 10 sheets of film piles up if you keep everything, right? Okay, so that's my pepper. It was a lot of fun. And when you're doing it, you're thinking, I wonder how this is going to come out. I wonder how, and it drives you. It gives you, there was a whole month there where I'm thinking, I'm going to have my own pepper shot. And it gives you a lot of drive, inspiration to continue before I go on to the next shot. Now I can keep my eyes open. If I see something that I want to photograph in the funnel, maybe I'll use pepper as my background instead of salt. I put And I'll position something, and I can just do this because it's a lot of fun, you know. Now, having done all this work, I told my daughter, I said, I'm shooting a pepper. And so when I showed her the print, she goes, I don't get it, Dad. It's just a pepper. And I said, well, look at it. It's Mother Nature as an architect. I said, for this particular image, architecture is a good way to approach it because this pepper is perfect. Even though it's starting to shrivel up, it still has this feeling of being alive, and it's still moving in terms of it's shrinking now. It's getting old, and there's it's a living thing. It's a progress. It's going through a process, and it's progressing its own consciousness. And for a moment in time, I captured it. To me, again, photographs are all about feeling. So this picture has a lot of feeling for me. It makes me feel. In a way, it wakes me up, and it makes me feel more alive because I'm more aware of this particular pepper. And I also told my daughter, I said, you know, when you look at architects who are inspired by nature, I said, just consider Frank Gehry, who designed the Disney Concert Hall, which is where the LA Symphony plays. You know, because Bob Cameron photographed the Disney concert, and I told her about it because she's a musician. She's studying music, and it's right here. So this is Frank Gehry's design of the Disney Concert Hall, and it looks like somebody stepped on, I don't know, a metal toy or something. So, and you know, it's considered an icon now. And I said, if someone took this pepper and decided to use it as inspiration for a building, and they made a building, art center or museum, or something, shaped like a pepper, a photography art gallery dedicated to photography in tribute to Edward Weston, right? If they built a building like that, it would really stand out in that particular city, and would be appreciated in time. Maybe not immediately, but in time. And you know, we are surrounded all the time by these masterworks of Mother Nature, and we walk right by it. I mean, there's peppers in every grocery store in this country, but no one ever stops us to look at it. Well, Edward Weston does that. He says, look at this. Look at this toilet. Look at the sculpture of this toilet. Look at this shell or this pepper. And that's what artists do. They awaken us to the beauty that's already there, I think. And so the pepper does that for me. So so that's my video on my pepper and how I masked that particular image. And that's fairly complicated masking, but you know, for a good 2 weeks there, I just looked at that print and I said, okay, how am I going to do this? And I would think about it. And then once I had it figured out in my head, then I went into the darkroom and I started doing it. And then it was only a matter of 2.5 days that I finally made the final mask after everything was dried. And you know, so for that span of time, I was really engaged in this particular project, in this, lack of a better word, definition of my life. You know, this is what I do. This is what I want to do in this. So I look forward to getting up next day and making the next mask or whatever. Okay. The last thing I want to say is, I had said that I'll make a print, and then years later I'll do it again. Well, that I have an example of that. This is my New York chairs. Okay, so this is, I shot this in 1982. I was sitting in a street cafe waiting for some coffee. The chairs were maybe 5 feet in front of me. I had my Rolleiflex, which is a twin lens camera. So I was looking through the top lens, but the photograph is made through the bottom lens. So one of the things that bothered me about this is this. The bottom leg is really close to the bottom part of the negative. But that's because when I looked through the top lens, I had more room. But when it shot the picture, it was down below. The lens is lower, so it made the bottom part of that leg, the bottom of the chair, closer to the border than I liked. Because I was so close. Then a Rolleiflex works really well if you're like shooting 10, 15 feet away from your subject. When you're close, that difference between the two lenses makes a bigger difference. So that always kind of bothered me. But other than that, I like this because of the feeling. I pulled out the detail on the top of the chair, and you can see I kept the detail. All those legs are separated. My mask did all that. And it's very energetic. High contrast. And then, I think a couple years ago I thought I'm going to do this again. So I went back to the negative. I went back to square one and masked it all over again. And I made this. And I decided to keep the border of the negative in so that I got that little bit more space between the bottom of the negative and that leg. And I kept a whole frame. And it's much more gentle. It's more like what it was when I shot it, because it was an overcast day. And I like this better now. But in between the two, there's a lot of years, right? So going back in and doing masking on a particular image can drastically change the feeling of a print. Consider how the legs stand out from the background here. I mean, they're both good prints. And maybe some people prefer the first one. I don't know. But masking can drastically change the feeling of a print. So I don't do a lot of I mean, I get some questions below my videos asking about alternative processes, and I don't do that too much. I do have examples of That's a shot my brother made. He shot this Lotus on Kodachrome, so it was originally a 35 millimeter slide. He was in Taiwan. It was probably in the 70s, and I always liked the picture, and I've made color photographs. But this one is a solarized negative, so you can see the tone separation. And I like this. So this is an example of an alternative process that I did. But I don't do that too much. Now I just, try to make nice, conventional looking black and white prints. And the masking is just a tool. When you look at hopefully when you look at my pepper, it just looks like a nice print. The purpose isn't to say, well, when you look at this print, can you see that I went through 10 sheets of film to make the final mask? That's not the point. The point is the masking is a tool to get here. And the more you know about the process, the more engaged you are with your craft and your art, and the more meaningful it is. And therefore, the conscious work that you do is imparted into the end product. And hopefully, some of that will be felt by anyone viewing the print. It's no guarantee, but you got to do something with your life, so you try to make it meaningful. Okay, and that's the main reason why I still like film, and I'm not too much into digital photography. Okay, so that's it. That's my lesson on specialized masking.